All right. Well, here we go. Last week we shifted just a little bit. We've been looking at the teachings of Jesus through his parables. Another facet of his use of imagery and metaphor is that he uses these I am statements. And we introduced the I am statements last week, and we're going to be looking at, if you will, the parable type language in the Gospel of John. Not parables like story parables, but technically parables are anytime you are speaking the teaching using imagery and metaphor. And Jesus does that with his I am statements. We looked last week at how sometimes there's lots of I am statements in the Gospel of John. They aren't actually rendered in the English translations. Sometimes the same construction, ego eimi, I am the bread of life, ego eimi, I am the light of the world. That same construction, ego eimi, is used quite frequently in the Gospel of John, but it's not translated I am. It's translated it is I, or something like that. And you wouldn't know that you had just bumped into an I am statement unless you were reading it in the Greek. And we're going to run into one of those today while we discuss I am the bread of life. He says in chapter 6 twice, I am the bread of life. But another time in chapter 6, he uses ego eimi, or I am, but it's probably not noticed in your English translation, but we'll slow down and look at that as we begin to explore the first I am statement in this series, which is I am the bread of life. I want to try to get at a few things. What are the Old Testament roots of this claim that Jesus makes? I am the bread of life. What are the Old Testament roots? The other question I want to try to pursue is, are there any Lord's Supper overtones in the claim, I am the bread of life? And then finally, what does this claim mean? What is it that Jesus is saying about himself when he says, I am the bread of life? Taking into consideration the Old Testament roots that point back, and perhaps taking into consideration the anticipation of the new covenant and the new meal of the covenant, the Lord's Supper, taking all those things into consideration, what does Jesus mean when he says, I am the bread of life? It'll probably require more than just this one installment to get at adequate answers to those questions, but let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in John chapter 6, but we'll be also looking in the Old Testament some. I think even though we're doing a series on the I am statements, I think it's a mistake to just treat the speech where Jesus says, I am the bread of life, without taking in the fuller context. I don't think we'll adequately grasp what Jesus is trying to say in his speech toward the end of John 6 at Capernaum in the synagogue. I don't think there'll be much to hang that on unless we were to back up and look at the early part of chapter 6, which is the setup for the synagogue in Capernaum speech where he says, I am the bread of life. So let's back up all the way to the beginning of chapter 6. This is in a section in the Gospel of John called the Festival Cycle. There are several festivals, or Jewish festivals, feasts, that sort of orient the ministry of Jesus, or Jesus' ministry unfolds within the setting of these different Jewish festivals. And we're going to see that this story in John chapter 6 is in the context of right around the time of a Jewish festival, and the author lets us know that. chapter 6, verse 1. Sometime after this, we're in the Gospel of John, chapter 6. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs that he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. So keep in mind that all of this is going to happen during the time of the Jewish Passover feast. Chapter 6, verse 4. The author wants you to know that what is about to be revealed about the ministry of Jesus is happening during the Jewish Passover feast. So during the Passover, this annual festival, this annual celebration, during the Passover, people are thinking about certain themes, certain stories, certain constitutive stories that tell them who they are and reveal to them what God is like. Well, when Jesus looked up, verse 5, and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" So let's first of all just acknowledge that this story is unfolding with the themes of Passover in the backdrop, that people are thinking about and starting to celebrate and anticipate the Jewish Passover. And then as the crowd is gathering towards Jesus, notice, by the way, verse 3, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. That should be your clue. If the Passover mention isn't a clue, how about this? Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down. They saw miraculous signs that Jesus had done. It's Passover time. Jesus sees the crowds coming toward him and he says, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" We're already seeing some indicators that there's a connection between Jesus and Moses. There's a connection in the minds of the people that Jesus is perhaps a new Moses, a Moses 2.0. Here's Jesus on the mountainside. Here's Jesus performing these miraculous signs during Passover season. Think about Moses. When you think about miracles in the Old Testament, there's one person that figures prominently, and it's the signs and wonders that God did through Moses. Passover is the commemoration, it's the celebration of God's deliverance of his covenant people. How God brought his covenant people out of Egyptian bondage, and he used Moses to do so. So Moses is a key figure in the Passover celebration, and now Jesus is doing Moses kinds of things. Going up on the mountain, doing miraculous signs, verse 2. And now, look at this. Jesus looks and he sees this crowd. So we've got a crowd coming to him in the wilderness, near a mountain, on a mountainside, during Passover time. And he asks a question, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? A crowd away from civilization, on a mountain, and concern about food. Sounds a whole lot like what you might read in Exodus, or in Numbers, or in Deuteronomy. In fact, Jesus asked, and it's a little bit of a well, it's not a real question. He says, where should we buy bread for these people to eat? And the author lets us know that this is not a real question. He asked this, verse 6, only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So it looks like Jesus is concerned. It looks like Jesus is scratching his head wondering, how in the world are we going to feed these people? And he even poses the question to Philip. But Jesus is not actually concerned about how he's going to feed these people. He's just going to test them. See if they've made sense of Jesus' abilities based on his previous miraculous signs. Look at Numbers chapter 11. As we think about the connection of John 6 with Moses, look how Moses talks in Numbers chapter 11. Look what he says in verse 13. Where can I get meat for all these people? Moses asked. Out in the wilderness, where can I get meat for all these people? And look at what Jesus says. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, that's a little thing. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, but I think it's more than that. Look at the context. Look at how Moses feels about things at this particular time in the wilderness. Back up to Numbers chapter 11, verse 10. Moses heard the people of every family wailing, each at the entrance to his tent. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised an oath to their forefathers? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.'" I like the way the King James renders this. "Give us flesh to eat." Give us flesh to eat. Especially if you know John 6 very well, you'd appreciate the King James version that doesn't say meat, it says flesh. If you know what Jesus is going to say in John chapter 6. Where can I get flesh for all these people? They keep wailing to me, "Give us flesh to eat." I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, Moses complains to God, put me to death right now, if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin. Okay, well, this is the setup for when God miraculously provides quail. Having given manna, now he's going to give them meat or flesh to eat, just quail. Jesus asks a similar question to Moses, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? But unlike Moses, Jesus knows the answer. He already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip talks about how much money it would take, but he doesn't really answer the question of where are we going to buy it. Andrew doesn't answer the question either. Rather, he offers up a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Well, if there's 5,000 men, there may be as many as 20,000 people. So here's Jesus on a mountainside, asking questions, even if not genuine questions, testing questions, like Moses, but unlike Moses, he knows the answer. And now he's going to bring about provision for this crowd at the mountain miraculously. It all sounds a whole lot like the stuff of the Passover, the stuff of the deliverance, the stuff that we get from Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers. There was plenty of grass. The men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks. The Greek word for this is Eucharisto. Eucharisto. I give thanks. Eucharisto. It's where people, if you grew up in a more formal tradition, you called the communion or the Lord's Supper the Eucharist. The Eucharist. Eucharisto. It just means the give thanks. And Jesus here gives thanks and distributes the bread to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. Let nothing be lost, is another way of translating it. Peter, have you gathered all the basketfuls? Did we get all 12 basketfuls? Andrew, did you gather all the leftovers? Let nothing be lost. Judas, have you gathered up the leftovers? Let nothing be lost. After the people saw the miraculous signs that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." There was this longing, there was this belief, there was this anticipation, and it's a biblical anticipation, that another prophet was going to come into the world, a prophet like Moses. The antecedent of that wish, of that hope, was Deuteronomy chapter 18. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 18. Start with verse 14. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 14. "The nations you will dispossess, listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me." So Deuteronomy would be the second giving of the law that Moses gives to the people. These are now the children that have grown up and the ones that are going to go into the promised land. And Moses himself is not going to go into the promised land with them. So on the plains of Moab, he gives the law again. And this is part of the giving of the law, and that is the promise that there will be a prophet like me, Moses says. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him." Well, who is going to follow Moses that's like Moses, that is a deliverer like Moses, that reveals the will of God like Moses, that does miraculous wonders and signs that God has enabled him to do like Moses? So there was a longing and a hope and an anticipated fulfilled promise that God was going to bring a Moses 2.0, another prophet like Moses. And look, the people actually say this. Verse 14, "After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world.'" Now, apparently they confused or compounded the idea that when a prophet like that comes into the world, that prophet is to be a king. The anticipated prophet is also the anticipated Messiah. Well, they were kind of right, weren't they? They were right. Jesus fulfills the role of the prophet like Moses. They were right. Jesus fulfills the role of a Davidic Messiah. But they didn't know really what this prophet was actually saying about God. They didn't know what this king, what his rule, what his reign was actually going to be like. So notice, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force. Once they understand or believe that he is the prophet who is to come, they are going to make him king by force. He is the one. He is our deliverer, just like Moses. Moses is not simply a mouthpiece for God. He's also a deliverer. And so, just as Moses was the instrument through whom God delivered Israel out of Egyptian bondage from a Pharaoh, we've got a new Pharaoh called the Caesar, and we need to be delivered from Roman bondage and oppression. And so this new Moses is going to be our deliverer, and he will be our new king. And Jesus knew they were thinking that, so he went up to a mountain. He withdrew from them and went up to a mountain by himself. By the way, that also sounds familiar, doesn't it? He leaves the crowd and he goes to a mountain by himself. That also feels eerily familiar if you're familiar with the Moses story. We keep going, and all of this is just a setup for when Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Please understand that every contour of this story is drawing on that story that gives Israel her identity. The story of the Exodus, the story of the Passover, the story where Moses is a central figure. So we'll do a little bit more building up the context, and we're actually probably not going to get to the statement itself or the speech itself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. Verse 20, but he said to them, Ego eimi, don't be afraid. Your translation may say, it is I. But the Greek says, ego eimi. Ego is the pronoun I. Eimi is the phrase I am. So it's an emphatic I am. Don't be afraid. I am. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So, do we still have a Moses motif here, or have we dropped all that? As the writer, the author of the fourth gospel, as John composes this, is he still telling the story in such a way to draw the reader, to remind the reader, to connect the reader between Jesus and Moses, that Jesus fulfills the longing for a new Moses, but he totally reinterprets it? Or have we lost that motif now? A strong wind on the water, and Jesus making a path on the water. And then, notice this, immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Immediately they find themselves on dry land. If you didn't, that's something that a lot of people don't notice. What does it mean? Immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Just like that, immediately. Verse 21. Well, one way to think about what God did, I will go before you. I will go before you, and I will fight the battle for you. Only trust me, I will go before you. One way to think about the parting of the Red Sea is that God cleared a path. In fact, look at Psalm 77. God made his path through the sea, and the people followed him. He went before them, and they followed him through the Red Sea. Psalm 77, verse 16. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water, the skies resounded with thunder, your arrows flashed back and forth, your thunder was heard in the whirlwind, your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You were walking through the sea. And that's how you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. We didn't see your footprints, but that was your way, that was your path. You were walking through the sea. Jesus, in a context where he says, draws on Exodus 3 language, I am, don't be afraid, I am, is making a path through the sea in a context of strong winds and water. So all of this is going to build up and make the claim, I am the bread of life, make a little more sense when we see that he's not just looking at a loaf of bread saying, well, that's me, I'm the loaf. There's a whole lot more that informs this claim. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. God bless.